Hey everybody, my name is Derek, and today I'm honored to be here with AJ Baime. AJ authored the book Dewey Defeats Truman. He's authored a couple books, and he's written for publications such as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And today we're going to talk about, of course, Truman took the office of the presidency after the death of FDR, and in 1948 he was set with this situation that was pretty difficult in terms of politics, in terms of winning this election. And a lot of people advised him not to run, and he ran, and of course he won. But it was an interesting story in terms of how he got from being behind in the polls and being sinking in popularity, and how he made his way to another term in office. And this is what this book covers. It's an awesome story. One of the things I love about it is that AJ just brings a lot of story to it. As he describes it like a story. It's very interesting to read. It's not like a boring history book. And he's going to talk to us about that, and also about his personal interaction with Harry S. Truman. He has an interesting story in terms of how he personally relates to Harry S. Truman. So AJ, thanks for being here. Can you tell us a bit about how you got interested in Harry S. Truman?
I can. Let me just start by saying thank you, and thank you to anybody who's tuning in. I'm proud to be in Rolla with you. I spent a lot of time in Missouri over the years researching Harry Truman, talking to people about Harry and President Truman, and it's just such a wonderful place, and I'm honored to be with you. Anytime I get a chance to come back to Missouri, I get really excited, and I'm really hoping, as enjoyable as this is to be with you, that the next time we do this, we can do it in person. So to answer your question, when I was growing up, my father had a portrait of Harry S. Truman on his wall. And I was just a kid growing up. And if all I cared about was baseball. And, it was this picture on the wall. I didn't know who the guy was. I thought he was probably my great grandfather. I never asked. But later in life, after I read David McCullough's biography of Truman, which probably a lot of people listening to have read that book, I came back to him, and it was a wonderful way for me to engage with my father. And he would explain to me what Truman meant to him, why he was a Truman fan, and what he thought why Harry Truman really symbolized a lot of the best things about America. And so that's how it started. When I told my father years ago I wanted to start writing about Truman, I've written 2 books about Truman, and I have a new book coming out next year where Truman makes a big entry toward the end of the book. But when I told my father, he said, "You can't do that. You can't write about Truman," because David McCullough's book was so good and so thorough. He just said, "McCullough. So, and I was like, "Dad, I'm going down this path. It's time for some more books on Truman." And unfortunately, my father lived to my last book. This one I dedicated to my father, The Accidental President, and Dewey Defeats Truman is the second book I wrote about Truman. And my father passed away 2.5 months ago, and sadly, but I did come into possession of the portrait that he had on his wall for all those years, and now it's on my wall. I just want to show people this is what it was. This is what I grew up with, and this is the guy. I didn't know who he was.
Oh.
And, sorry
about that, AJ.
There we go. So I now I have this very important family heirloom, but that's how it started.
Awesome. And you want to show that picture again now that I got you on full screen? I'm sorry about that, man.
That's okay.
Yeah, well, there we go. And that was the portrait on your father's wall?
This was the portrait on my father's office wall that I grew up with. And now it's on my wall, yeah.
Awesome. Now, as you wrote The Accidental President, and you wrote Dewey Defeats Truman. As you began to research this man, both the diary, so you had the letters and the personal interactions, you had kind of the private glimpses into his life, and then you also had the speeches, of course, which a historian will do. They'll research the speeches that they give, the debates, all that. How did your sense of Harry S. Truman mature? How did it grow into what's your sense of him now as somebody who has studied the various primary sources on Harry S. Truman?
Well, I think the best way to answer that is when you go into the Truman archives and you start really digging through things. When you're writing a book like this, the first thing you do is you file your Freedom of Information Act requests. So that's the first thing you do, because a lot of times that will take a lot of time. So you want to find out what's in the FBI files. So maybe not just on Truman, but some of the characters around him. Maybe there's another character in the book who, so that's the first thing that you do when you do this kind of nonfiction research. The next thing you do is go to the source material. And Truman, Truman, the Truman Archives are amazing. And I encourage people, go to the museum, and the library just reopened. They did this multi-year, multi-million-dollar renovation, and it's incredible. It's incredible. The artifacts in there just really bring history to life. But there's also the archives there. And there's really, you can sort of categorize everything in those archives in two different buckets, if you will. There's the sort of public papers, the presidential papers, the stuff that, President Truman had his hands on in the Oval Office, the kinds of decisions that were made. There are a tremendous number of oral histories. And in writing this kind of history, that's very, very important, because you get a lot of dialogue in there and stuff like that. But there's also the very personal side. So there's the tremendous amount of letters that Truman wrote to his daughter, to his sister, to his mother, and to his wife. And so you really you need to really capture this man and his times. You need both of those windows into his personality. And to me, that was like the most important thing, because what really brought him to life for me, and what I tried to bring to life on the page, was such an amazing human, and outside of what the public saw. And just the way that he cared about his wife and the way that he cared about his daughter, I thought really helped me to identify him. And hopefully when people read the book, that's like such an important window into his personality, and makes him a very engaging character, somebody you really want to root for.
Awesome. Yeah. And that was my sense as I was reading the book. It was just amazing to see how his personality was just something else. I see a lot of people are jumping on. I want to thank everybody who's jumping on. Of course, I'm here with AJ Baime, and he's the author of Dewey Defeats Truman. If you have questions or comments, feel free to post those wherever you happen to be watching them, whether it's on YouTube or Facebook. We will have a little question and answer time. Also, if you want to just say hi, whatever comments you want to make, go ahead and make them. I will say, if you have questions, ask them throughout the event. Don't be shy. We will get to them. I might not get to them immediately, but we will get to them as the process unfolds. So just go ahead and pop them in as they come, and I will get to them as we go on. And then, AJ, I'm wondering if you just tell us about how Harry S. Truman rose to this position where he became the vice president during FDR's final term.
It's a great question. And it takes me quite a few pages, like a large chapter, to explain that, because it's such an incredibly exciting thing that happens in this man's life. But the broad brushstrokes of it are, he's this obscure senator. It's 1944. And he how he got into the Senate, how he ended up in Washington. Again, it's an incredible story. How this obscure farmer sort of became a politician by mistake, and fate lifts him out of obscurity, out of the farm belt, and throws him into Washington, and he has to learn how to survive. So anyway, he gets to 1944. He's ready to go to the Democratic National Convention to give the acceptance speech for James Burns to be the vice presidential candidate in 44. And when he gets there, he finds out that there's some backdoor machinations going on. And suddenly he finds himself in the situation where they're trying to get him to run for vice president. The convention system was different back then. So the delegates actually had to vote. It wasn't so much so that the candidate said, well, this is my vice presidential candidate. The delegates had to vote. So Truman was going to give this speech for James Burns, and he gets there and he finds out that there are these powerful figures who really want him to be the VP candidate. And he's stunned, and he's shocked, and he's scared. He knows FDR's health is not well. He had no intention of ever running for vice president, had no desire to run for vice president. And all of a sudden, they're trying to convince him to do it at the convention, and he refuses. And there's this amazing scene in the book where I think it's at the Blackstone Hotel there in Chicago. And Truman's in this smoky hotel room, and there's noise and this and that. And he gets dragged over, and they put him on a telephone, and it's President Roosevelt. And the president says, Harry Truman, I don't know you, but if you don't run, you're going to destroy the Democratic Party. And so he's like, all right, you're the chief executive. I have to run. So now he has to go out, and not only does he have to run, he has to convince all of these people to vote for him, but he's supposed to give a nomination speech for someone else. So it's really incredible how it happens and how it ends. He ends up on the ticket, and he goes up and gives the shortest acceptance speech ever because, he didn't expect it to be happening. He didn't want it to happen. He's terrified. His wife is very unhappy because his wife didn't want this to happen. And then it finally ends. They go out into the street out of the convention, and they're mobbed by reporters. And Mrs. Truman turns to Harry Truman, and she says, "Is it going to be like this for the rest of our lives?" And that's how the story sort of begins. How he ends up, in the Oval Office eventually.
That's amazing. One of the quotes from Harry S. Truman, he had some awesome quotes, and one of the quotes he had that I love is. He compared being president to being like riding on a tiger. It sounds like he got off to a wild start too, but he said something to the effect of being president is about like riding a tiger. You don't get off, otherwise if you do, you get swallowed up. And I'm wondering if you could tell me and tell the audience, what are some of the issues right after World War II has ended that are threatening to swallow up Harry S. Truman as he's going out and he's kind of going into this world of the post-World War II environment?
Excellent. So he becomes president, I think, April 12th, 1945. And this book is about the first 4 months of his presidency. So in this book, it's about a guy who becomes president by mistake, and incredible things happen in that 4 months, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this book starts right where the other one ends, right at the end of World War II, where he has to sort of become the president in his own right and create what he believes is, his philosophy, his political, his social philosophy is going to be. And there's absolute chaos. So at the end of the war, we've dropped the atomic bomb. We've won the war. There's tremendous enthusiasm and excitement and support because Harry Truman was such an underdog. Americans were very happy and very proud of what he had accomplished in this 4 months' time. But now it's this earth-shattering moment where the country has to transform into a peacetime economy. All the soldiers are coming home. There's a housing shortage. There's a labor crisis. Everything that goes wrong, you can imagine, because it was such an tectonic shift in terms of everything going on in our country, in every society, cities, farms, towns, businesses. And so he basically, his approval ratings go straight down the tube. So that's what happens in the first chapter of Dewey Defeats Truman, is that he becomes a very, very unpopular president very quickly. It's my personal theory that no president could have led the country through those months, those first few months out of World War II, successfully in a way that Americans really would have embraced him or her. It just would have been impossible. There was too many crises for him to handle. And that's what he meant by riding the tiger, because he had to constantly be making extremely important decisions every day. And everything was a moving target. So he would make a decision and he wasn't sure how any of this stuff was going to turn out. And people just became very unhappy with him very quickly.
Fascinating. When I was in college, I loved to defend Harry S. Truman's legacy with some of my fellow undergrads, and it's interesting. It seems like a lot of historians seem to think that Harry S. Truman was a good president. Now, in retrospect, but a lot of the undergrads, they'd be like, "Well, he was just unprepared, and that's why everything was crazy for him." But the thing is, he had a lot to deal with on his plate after this, World War II. I mean, it was the conclusion of World War II, and you had all these new problems that had been developing. It was just a very tough thing. So he comes to 1948 as the underdog. And can you tell us, in terms of politics, what is making his position difficult?
Well, many things. One of them is basically, if you think of 1948, the election, it's the first election in the post-war era. It's the first of the atomic age. It's the first, election night broadcast. There's a sense that it was really a dividing line between the past and the future. And both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. I spent a lot of time in this book talking about what was happening in the Republican Party. And Thomas Dewey is a very major figure in this book because he's fascinating. And I wanted to explore, the whole political picture. Elections are sort of like snapshots of a country that freeze in time. So you can look at an election and say like, well, that's what that country was at that time. You can sort of enumerate it. Now, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party were having identity crises. And Truman, going into the election, the Democrats had been in control since, early 1933 when FDR came into power. So that's a long time. And the whole country was ready for new leadership. The whole country felt that voters were going to swing to the Republican column just because the Democrats had been in power for so long and so many things were going horrifically wrong. So that alone put Truman in the hot seat. Now, there's a lot of talk today about civil rights, and civil rights was an incredibly important issue during the election. And what happened was the political parties were realigning themselves. And what Truman tried to do, which is fascinating, and he did it very successfully, is he realized that the African-American vote was going to be more important than it ever had before. But he also realized that there was a terrific wave of racial violence against Black people right after the war. And specifically, there were a number of really horrific incidents in which African Americans had returned from war, and they were veterans. They were American veterans. They had fought in the war, and they were attacked and killed in their own country by murderers who did their acts with impunity. And the things that we're hearing about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, like those things were happening even on a much bigger scale at that time. And Truman decided to take a stand. And that was really the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. The problem was that stand he took to push this a civil rights agenda in a historic way, it never happened before, really offended a huge power base of his own Democratic Party, what we call the solid South of the Democratic Party. And that's why the party shattered during the election season. That's where the Dixiecrats came from. And it was the beginning of the slow movement of the solid South of the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, into the arms of the Republican Party, happened over a few years. But so even if you looked at the Democratic Party at the time, and Truman was the head of it, the party was shattering. He was tremendously unpopular. Americans were ready for new leadership. They were ready for the swing to the Republicans. And that's why, that's just sort of the basic levels of why nobody believed that Truman could win in 48.
That's a great summary. You mentioned it fractured. The Democrat Party was kind of in shambles at that point, and Harry S. Truman was kind of this guy who was running for president. It was a four-way race between kind of the major colorful characters. Can you tell us what were some of the dynamics of this race? As what's Harry S. Truman's place in between? So he's got Dewey over here, there's the main opponent, and then he's got two other opponents. Can you tell us about those other candidates?
I can, and I think it's very important that both of those candidates came out of the shattered Democratic Party. So Truman is leading the Democrats into the 48 election. The left flank, the liberal flank of the Democrats, breaks away, and they have their own candidate in Henry Wallace. There's a book about Henry Wallace right there. It's the only biography that's ever been written about him, but he's a fascinating character. And I follow his campaign in the book, and his politics were pretty far to the left. And he believed that he was sort of this messianic character, almost like a godlike character who was going to save the country from World War III. He thought that if he didn't win this election, we were going to have another world war quickly, soon, and possibly atomic genocide. And so he goes out on this campaign saying, I am the candidate of peace, and you have to vote for me, or the consequences are pretty big. And his politics are so controversial that when he is on the coast, he's in Los Angeles, he's in New York, he can pack stadiums. He packed Yankee Stadium, packed it with fans who paid money to see him speak. But then he would go and campaign in rural places, particularly in the South, and there would be stabbings, beatings. It would literally, if you can picture a man running for president on a lectern giving a speech while getting hit with eggs, literally, where there's egg yolk coming off his head, he would be hit with tomatoes and ice cream cones because he was so he was not well liked in places like, rural North Carolina. But it's incredible. He knew what he was doing, and he went down there and he campaigned and he showed up, and he would show up to campaign, and there would be crowds of people and riots, and he'd need riot police just to get him inside the speaking hall. He was an incredible man. He won 0 electoral votes, 0. But his candidacy, I think, was really important in terms of like really understanding what was going on in 1948 and why his policies were so polarizing, embraced by so many and reviled by others. The same way we see, to some degree with Donald Trump today. It's kind of a similar thing in that he's loved by many and hated by many. That was sort of what Henry Wallace's position was in. It was not an easy way to go into the 48 election. The other one is Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond is, he ends up leading the Dixiecrats. And what this was all about was civil rights. And Truman wanted a campaign for civil rights. He wanted African Americans to be allowed to vote in the South. He wanted them to be protected by the law like everybody else, like it says in the 14th and 15th Amendment of our Constitution. And this offended a lot of people. And so this massive number of Democrats in states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, a little bit in Florida, they formed the Dixiecrats, and they launched their own campaign. I'm going to read you one quote because it just puts in perspective. This is what Strom Thurmond said at the Dixiecrat at the National Convention when they in Birmingham, Alabama. He gets up there and says, "I'm running for president," and he says, "I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that there's not enough troops in the army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our churches. These uncalled for and these damnable proposals Truman has recommended under the guise of so-called civil rights. I'll tell you, the American people had better wake up and oppose such a program, because the next thing will be a totalitarian state in the United States." And when he says that, he's not speaking like I am. He's screaming into the microphone, and you can watch it. You can see it on YouTube. Look it up. It's fascinating.
Interesting. And so we have that's kind of gives us a picture of the Democrat Party. Can you tell us, in terms of ideology, in terms of policy, how is Dewey related to Truman, and how does he differ?
That's a great question. So like the Democrats, the Republicans have a sort of identity crisis. They're coming out of the war years, and they've got to come out and say, look, this is who we are. This is what the Republican Party stands for. And this is, the path that we're going to follow into the post-war world. And their identity crisis is, again, between left and right, between liberal and conservative. And the conservative faction of the party is really led by these powerful figures on Capitol Hill, senators, congressmen, led by pretty much, they called him Mr. Republican, and that was Robert Taft of Ohio. Very powerful senator. Some people, Richard Nixon later said that if Taft had run in 48, there's no way he would have lost, that Taft would have won. He represents the conservative side of the Republican Party. Dewey was really a Teddy Roosevelt Republican, and his father was a Teddy Roosevelt Republican, and that's why Thomas Dewey's initials were TED, Thomas E. Dewey, and Ted. So that had something to do with where his name came from. So this was a very passionate family about the politics of Teddy Roosevelt, and that is a very different form of republicanism. And so going into the Republican National Convention, you have this tug of war between right and left, and Dewey comes out on top, and how he does it is really incredible. Part of it is this. Part of one of the scenes leading up to this is the first live radio broadcast political debate nationwide. It had never happened before, and this is between Dewey and Harold Stassen, two characters. It's the Oregon primary. There's just so many episodes and chapters of the story that that could be their own book alone because they're so exciting. But eventually, Dewey wins the nomination, and so he goes into this election, and it's strange because he's a liberal Republican, and a lot of the things that he wanted to do, he agreed with Harry Truman. They kind of agreed with each other. And that's why when Truman goes out and campaigns in 1948, he doesn't really campaign against Dewey. He doesn't bring up Dewey a lot. He campaigns against the 80th Congress. He campaigns against the conservative Republicans on Capitol Hill. And he really, truly believed that if he lost the election, that those conservative Republicans were powerful enough to put the country in Wall Street's hands. That's really what he thought. He was worried that Wall Street was going to become too powerful and everyday Americans like himself and his family were going to suffer. But anyway, Dewey wins the nomination and off they go.
That's a great summary. Let's see. So of course, Truman's approval ratings, he had these issues in the post-World War II environment. Like you said, not sure if there are many presidents, or anybody, lone enough presidents who could have dealt with some of these issues without taking a beating on the approval ratings. It's just the way it is. So Truman's faced with, his approval ratings and they look rough. And he was speaking to members of the DNC, and I'm going to read specifically what you have in the book here. It says, he said, the situation isn't as bad as the newspapers make it look. My intention is to go into every county in the United States if possible. I want to see the people. Can you tell us about how there's a special train that played a big role in this? What's the role of that train, and how did this idea of let's go talk to the people play out for Truman?
Wonderful question. So it kind of begins like this. Truman was not a good public speaker. Following in the footsteps of FDR, this really hindered him. This was a problem. And at one point in, I think it was 1947, he gives a small speech in the White House to a group of newspaper editors. And at the end of his speech, he goes, look, let me level with you. This is all off the record. And he just starts to talk. And everybody in the crowd's like, that's the guy that needs to run for president. Because if he tries to orate, he's no good. But if he becomes Harry, if he just sort of becomes himself, that people would identify with him, they would understand him, they would like him, they would get it. And so he comes up with this idea to run this campaign in which he's going to get on a campaign trail and go all the places that presidential candidates never go, every small town that he could get. And that's where the term whistle stop comes from, because the idea of a whistle stop was it's a town so small that the train comes in, the whistle blows, and there's no need to get on or off. The train keeps going because there's nothing there to get. There's no reason to get off the train. That's a whistle stop. And so Truman comes up with this idea to go to every small town he can and give 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 speeches a day from the back of this campaign train. He would give speeches in his pajamas. He'd give speeches at 12 in the morning. He would give speeches to 15 people who were all on horseback. And then he would end up in some big city, Cleveland, Denver, LA, Seattle, and give a big speech that would be broadcast nationwide on the radio. And so really what he wants to do is expose people to the magic of the American presidency. And he wants people to understand who Harry is, because he thinks if he can get people to understand who Harry is, they'll vote for Harry. They might not vote for President Truman, but they'll vote for Harry. And in the process of doing this, it becomes a wonderful sort of travel story, because we know so much about what the train was like, what life was like on the train, what it was like for their press corps, what it was like for Mrs. Truman. Just little details like there was one bathroom and one shower. There was one shower on the train, and that was in Truman's quarters. Truman had a speedometer on the wall in his quarters, so he could always look and know how fast the train was going. There was no air conditioning, so they would literally pack the bottom of his train car with ice. That's their idea of air conditioning. And in the process of doing this, traveling all around the country, going through Oklahoma, and there's these amazing moments in Texas, and they're constantly running out of money, and the train stops, and they have to figure out how to get more money to keep the train going. And in the process of all this happening, it starts to build and build and build. And he gets closer to the election, and all of a sudden, these little towns he would go into, there'd be thousands and thousands and thousands of people in these little tiny towns, because something really important was happening. He had become not just a presidential candidate, but really an American folk hero.
That's awesome. And in the book you write, he's out of basically a lot of people are saying he's out of the race. This is Dewey's. This belongs to Dewey, and they're just going through the motions. But meanwhile, Harry S. Truman's going all over the country, and he's giving the Give 'em Hell Harry speeches. And I'm wondering, could you give us just some insight? You've already kind of done this, but could you give us some more insight into what is the energy of these speeches? How are people responding to them?
That's a great question. And I think it's a very important question, because if you imagine a guy who's going to give 9 speeches in one day in 9 different towns that he's never been to, what's he going to say? How's he going to know what, so they create this really interesting machinery. And what they do is they created in the summer of 1948, before the train left Washington, a research division. And we've got wonderful oral history. So all the people who worked in that research division, they did all these oral histories in the 1950s and 60s, telling, with great detail, explaining what it was like to work there. And, there was a construction site next door, so it was always really loud. And they left their families, and it had to be very secret. And what they did was they created these documents so that, and then they would put it all in this secret suitcase, and they would fly it in a small plane, and it would land. So the train would come through, the campaign train. They take this suitcase, and that would have the information that the research division had brought to Harry, so that he would know what to say in the next 9 towns in the next day, whatever, how many days. So when he went out to speak, he would speak almost entirely impromptu, except for the big radio broadcasts. These were speeches he made up on the spot. But when he goes out in the back of the train and say, Duluth, Minnesota, I don't know, he would have a card that would tell him facts about that town. Maybe there was a new sausage factory, or there was a local war hero who died there that he wanted to talk about. And so that's what he used to connect with his audience and make them understood that he cared about that little town and the people living there. And then he would launch into his message. And as you can imagine, there's a tremendous amount of bloopers that occurred. There's a number of times where he gave the speech to the wrong town. There's one time he comes in and he dedicates his speech to a war hero who had recently died, who they'd named a small airfield after. But it turned out it wasn't a war hero. It was a woman and her boyfriend who were joyriding in an airplane. And he's going on about this war hero who had passed away. And it wasn't even a man, it was a woman. And so there were a lot of mistakes that he made along the way that made for, comic relief. But really, ultimately, his message was that the United States of America really belongs to the people. And he was one of them. And his job was to protect the rights, the well-being of the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans who couldn't afford lobbyists in Washington. That's really what it came down to, what he told these people and these countless small towns.
Do you think, this is just a question that popped into my head, do you think that Truman's status as an underdog played a role in some people who, these are common people, they don't have lobbyists? Did that play a role in Truman's appeal, do you think?
Absolutely, without a doubt. I think Americans, and as a matter of fact, I'll read to you something. The last line in this book, there's two reasons really why it's important that he was such an underdog. One is Americans love an underdog who will do anything he can to win within, the realms of the law. When I was growing up, we had a VCR and we only had one movie in our house, and that was Rocky II. And so we watched Rocky II a lot. And that's a story about this underdog who, nobody knows who he is. And he goes out and, defeats the heavyweight champion of the world to become the champion. And this is sort of a story like that, in which, as the election was getting closer and closer, people were rallying around. They loved the way he was fighting. They were just fascinated by it. But the other reason why I think it's really important that he was such an underdog is, it's my theory, and there's really no way to prove this. You can look at all kinds of statistics, but you can't prove it. But I think that so few people thought he had any chance of winning that a lot of people, I think, who would have voted for Tom Dewey didn't show up at the polls because they thought, well, it's a waste of my time. I don't need to go because the election's already decided. Now, let me read it. This is the last line of the book, which sort of, I think, addresses your question. This is Arthur Vandenberg, very powerful senator, Republican senator from Michigan. This is what he said when he found out that Truman had won in 1948. He says, "You got to give the little man credit. There he was flat on his back. Everyone had counted him out, but he came up fighting and won the battle. He did it all by himself. That's the kind of courage the American people admire."
Wow. Yeah, that's he nailed it. Really, he did. Now, kind of taking this into Dewey's court, Dewey did not do really impromptu speeches. I don't get the sense from reading your book. He was more of a polished. He needed a polished set of rules. Do you think that give us some insight into what his speeches were like? How did he interact with his base of people and people he wanted to vote for him?
Well, there's this amazing moment where he goes out when he begins his campaign. He had a campaign philosophy that a lot of people in the Republican Party didn't agree with. And what Dewey said was, I ran an attack dog campaign in 1944 for president, 1940, and I lost. I ran an attack dog campaign, I think it was 38, for governor, and I lost. But when I won my two governors campaigns, when I won the governorship of New York twice, I ran a very different campaign, and that was a campaign just based on basically platitudes and poetics, a very highbrow campaign, a lot of speeches about, his term, he ran, the entire campaign was based on the word unity. That was his message. So he wasn't going to address real specific issues because he thought, well, when he comes president, then he would have made all these promises he can't keep. And he wasn't going to attack Truman because he thought, well, if I run this attack dog campaign, it hasn't worked in the past. So I'm going to go out there and give these eloquent, poetic speeches about unity. And at the beginning, he goes out, and I found this amazing newspaper article where a reporter, a political columnist, goes to his first big speech in the campaign, and he says, if it's a problem to be too perfect, then Dewey has a problem, because his speech was just perfect. There's nothing to say. There's no response. It was perfect. It was beautifully delivered. It was beautifully written. And Dewey, he was a trained baritone singer. He had this voice. But as the campaign goes by, people started to get tired of him talking about unity constantly. That was his message. He didn't want to say much more than that. And it destroyed his campaign. I really think that that's one of the reasons why he lost.
That's pretty interesting. And I guess kind of you have to appreciate Dewey's side of it too. He thought, this is how we bring the country together. But it's it's interesting that he would be the one for unity and let's all get together. He was a fairly, as people will discover, of course, we're talking about Dewey defeats Truman. As people will discover as they read this book, he was a fairly aggressive prosecutor. He was not really afraid to take people on that were dangerous. And it's just interesting that he kind of takes this, I guess it was a strategic move, and it didn't pay out.
That's absolutely right. And I think you pointed to something really interesting. Dewey's rise, like Truman's, it's just a fascinating story. Here's a guy who becomes the youngest district attorney in the Southern District of New York, right at a time when there's this, essentially, right at the same time where the big gangs of New York, Murder Incorporated, all the Al Capones of the world, their rise was the same time as Dewey's, and he became so famous as a crime fighter that there were two movies starring Humphrey Bogart as this like Dewey-esque district attorney. There were, two movies with Humphrey Bogart that were made about Dewey's rise. And it's a very touching moment. He had to sort of be convinced in 1948 to run for the presidency because he had lost. He had come closer than anybody else had, closer than Wendell Willkie, closer than anybody had to beating FDR. But he still lost in 1940. And he was worried that he had this amazing career. He was he won his second term that he won in Albany as the governor of New York was by the largest margin in the history of the state. He was very, very popular, very accomplished, very successful. And he thought, well, if I run for president in 1948 and I lose, that's what I'm going to be remembered for. Everybody's going to remember me as the guy who lost twice, and that's it. And sadly, that's what happened. That's true. And he ultimately decided to run in 1948 because I think that he thought that there was no way he wasn't going to win.
Mm. Speaking of winning and losing, can you take us into the election night? So can you compare and contrast for us? What was Harry S. Truman? Obviously, one had a good night and one didn't. But if you could give us some kind of insight into how Harry S. Truman experienced election night and how Thomas Dewey experienced election night.
Well, one thing I can say is that when I was researching and writing this book, when I was writing that chapter of the election night, when you write a book like that, so you write something and then you write it over and you do it again and you do it again and you do it again. Then you leave it there for a few months and you start at the beginning and get back there and then you do it 3 more times. And my point is, every time I worked on that chapter, I couldn't get through it without crying myself. It was so moving to try to put myself in Tom Dewey's shoes of what he experienced that night. The Hotel Roosevelt in New York City. He goes, he votes. He goes and has dinner with his friends, some friends in New York, and there's pie. It's exciting. They've got the radio on. Then he goes back to the Hotel Roosevelt, to his suite there, and he's supposed to come down at 9 o'clock and give his acceptance speech. He's give his speech that I'm the president of the United States. Thank you for electing me. And at 7 o'clock, the Republican National Committee in Washington, their offices begin sending out press releases saying, okay, now it's confirmed. Thomas Dewey has been elected the next president of the United States. And they do this basically every 2 hours, at 7 o'clock, at 8:30, and we have all the documents. They're fascinating. It is now confirmed over and over and over this is happening. And meanwhile, it's 9 o'clock. Everybody's gathered at campaign headquarters ready for the candidate to come out and make a speech, and things start to get really weird. And people start leaving headquarters, a lot of the reporters, and going over to the Democratic headquarters because they can see that something's happening here. And meanwhile, Thomas Dewey, he's upstairs in his suite with his family. He's a former lawyer, so he has these yellow legal pads. He shuts himself in a room with a legal pad and a pen and a radio, probably a TV too. I don't know. We're not sure. But he begins to realize what is happening. And he doesn't make an appearance until the next morning. And he comes out in front of these reporters and he says, they're like, what happened? And he's like, I don't know. I'm going to wait and see what you all think happened, what you write about. But for him to come out in front of those reporters. And another thing about Dewey is, like, he gave his climactic speech at the Madison Square Garden. I think it was Halloween. No, it was Halloween night. Anyway, a couple of days before the election. Then he gets on the campaign train to go back to Albany, right? And he gives this impromptu off-the-record speech to his press corps, all the guys who are, following for the press, the newspapers, the radio, all this stuff. And he tells them, you can't print this, but I'm going to tell you, this is who's going to be my Secretary of State. This is who's going to be the Secretary of He tells them who's going to be his cabinet because he's so sure. And we know this because a lot of those reporters, they later did oral histories that, so we have a number of them who were there all telling the same story. And it's so sad, I felt for this man, and I felt like, honestly, Dewey would have made a very, very good 2-term president. And, the history of the country, it would have been different. Now, as for Truman, a very different experience. He votes, then he goes to a lunch in Independence, Missouri, that's hosted by a guy named Roger Sermon, who's an Independence high school buddy of Truman's. And during the lunch, he gets up and he says, I have to go to the bathroom. And he goes out the back door and disappears. And Secret Service drive him. They drive him to this hotel. And he checks into this hotel secretly. Nobody knows where he is, except for his wife and daughter. He has to borrow a bathrobe. He borrows some slippers. He doesn't have a suitcase or anything. He eats a ham sandwich and he goes to bed. And so he's asleep. He's world renowned for being able to sleep during highly stressful moments. And at some point, the Secret Service wake him up. And they're like, Mr. President, you're doing really well. He's like, leave me alone, go to bed. Phone rings. One of the only people who knows who he is. Mr. President, you only have to win either California, Ohio, or one other state. I forget. And he says, why? I'm going to win all 3. Don't call me again. Hangs up the phone. And then in the morning, the Secret Service wake him up and they say, Mr. President, you won. It's very moving. Sorry for him. And he says, let's go to Kansas City. And so they get in this limo, they drive down to Kansas City, and up in the Hotel Muhlenbach, the top floor is where the party is. And he secludes himself in a bedroom and he calls his wife to tell her what she probably already knew from listening to the radio. And somebody peeks in the door because It was Robert Nixon, who was a reporter with the United Press International. And he peeks in the door and he sees that President Truman is crying. He's talking to his wife on the phone. It's very moving.
Very, that's a great summary of both of them. Thank you. I want to remind everybody, of course, we're talking to A.J. Baime, author of the book Dewey Defeats Truman. We have this here at the library. You can also go out and buy a copy of this. I have one. This is my copy that I have on my history shelf. So it's a really cool book. He also wrote The Accidental President, which is a great book. These are just awesome books because they really bring to life Truman as a person, and really in a dynamic way. I tell you, people are like, politics, or we're sick of that. I'm telling you, you will enjoy this book. I've given it to multiple friends from multiple backgrounds. They love the story of Truman. It's really, to me, Harry S. Truman is one of those special people in history where multiple people from multiple different backgrounds can come and they're like, we get it with him. You know, it's just a story of him. Unless you're like some of my undergrad college students who were trying to look smart by being like, oh, he was not experienced and that's why it didn't work out. But no, seriously, this he has a great story, and AJ just did such a great job of bringing it to life.
Thank you, Derek.
You're welcome. I wanted to just remind everybody we have about 15 minutes left. So if you have any questions or comments at all, go ahead and drop those in about now. I want to thank everybody who's been watching. I've seen the number go up and down, so I appreciate everybody who's dropped in and has taken time to listen tonight. Now switching, so we of course know the results of the election, and there was some people like in the media, for example, who I think in your book you mentioned Robert Albright from the Washington Post, and you know, he steps back for a moment and he sees all the stuff that's going on. And he says, could we be wrong?
Could we be wrong?
Why did the media, why did the pollsters, why did they get it wrong?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. Well, we can start with the pollsters. For one thing, there were 5 of them, I think, at the time, the major ones. And 4 of them declared that Truman was way behind. And one of them stopped early in the campaigns and said, this is a waste of time and money. I'm not even going to do the polls because everybody knows what's going to happen, that Dewey's going to win. And when the whole thing ended and you know, a lot of people pointed fingers at the press and the pollsters, they had to answer for this. And they really couldn't come up with a very convincing answer of why they got it so wrong. And that's one of the reasons I think, you know, one of the things that made such a major difference was that a lot of Dewey voters just didn't show up because they thought they didn't have to. You know, a few days before the election, Truman gave this amazing speech, and it was sort of akin to like what we would call a fake news speech today, where he calls out the pollsters. He says, you know, all of these pollsters are working for newspapers that are owned by people who think it's in their best interest for me to lose this election. And, you know, the polls don't listen to those pollsters. They're wrong. They're biased. And, you know, and he was angry. He was really angry. But really in the end, we don't know the answer. You know, there's really no way to say. Nobody came up with a good reason why the polls got it so wrong.
Interesting. So that's kind of up in the air then. Awesome. And I'm wondering, so of course, you know, Truman's an underdog. That's, I think, probably for me as a reader of your book and as somebody who likes Truman, that's a big thing for me. I love that story of the underdog. What's something about Truman's character that you discovered as you're researching him and as you're seeing him approach this very difficult race?
Without a doubt, I think the most important thing for me was seeing how okay, it's great that he was an underdog and that he fought and he fought and he fought and he won. But the way he carried himself as a husband and as a father and as a brother and as, you know, that to me was just surprising. And, you know, we had so much material on it because Margaret was on you know, his daughter was on the train and she wrote a book about it, but she also kept a daily diary, and it's, you know, it's in the archives. We have it. And so that's what did it for me. You know, like it was the private man and how he carried himself. He didn't want to run in 48. He didn't want to be president because he really feared how it was hurting his family, how much it was hurting his family, and, you know, how their lives were, their privacy was destroyed by his success. And I hope that answers your question, but that to me was just inspiring, and that's what makes him such a sympathetic character. That's what made me want him to win, because watching the way he taught and protected his daughter, I just thought that was so special.
And I got that from the book as well. I remember there was a part in your book where somebody had written a negative story about his wife, and he goes up to him. It's like, look, you can say whatever you want to about me. I'm in this role, and you can be as rough with me as you want, but you're not going to do that to my wife. And I think he like threatened to punch him in the nose if he ever did it again or something.
He did. He did. So what happened was, what happened was a newspaper reporter had said something about Bess and Margaret taking seats on a train where there were military men who there wasn't room and they didn't get on the train. And Truman believed that that story was entirely false. And so in the Oval Office at a press conference, he went up to that reporter, took his finger, jammed it in his chest like that. And he says, you can call me a rat. You can call me a liar. You can call me anything you want. But the next time you say something false about my wife, I'm going to knock you out. And don't think I won't. I just love that. That was great.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. It's just a fascinating man. Another aspect of his character that's pretty interesting, and I've noticed this not just from your book, but from others I've read. When you look at Truman, he has this very confident, often persona that he portrays. But then you get to read the diaries and what he's saying to friends, and you're seeing the part of the man that's, I don't know about this. I don't know that I really want to even be president if I can win this presidency, because we've got all these problems. Can you give us a little bit of idea into more of his vulnerable state?
Yeah. Firstly, let me say I apologize if you can hear it. There's a bunch of people talking loudly right outside my window. And so
I can just barely.
Okay, hang on.
Okay.
Anyway,
I think that worked.
I don't think it worked at all.
Oh.
So your question was what made him vulnerable?
Yes.
Well, for starters, I think we touched on it right away already. Just the idea that he was very uncomfortable having to raise a college-age daughter who, she went to George Washington University, and the press followed her around. She wanted to be a singer, and there's this famous moment in Truman's career where she got a bad review from the Washington Post music critic, Paul Hume, and he wrote this amazing letter to Paul Hume telling him exactly what he thinks. And he literally says, but it's in the book. I don't want to offend anybody with any, anyway.
That's very good. We do have some patrons like that here, so we'll just keep that to the imagination. But knowing Truman, it was probably good.
That I think was the most important thing. And then just the whole idea of like what it was like to be president during that era. There was just so much crisis that I just felt like he was at an intersection of advice where, everybody he knew was telling him to do something completely different, and none of them were right at all. And decision he needed to make. And there's a reason why. One of the questions I get asked so often is, why were his approval ratings so low when he left office, and yet he's considered number 6 or number 7 of the best presidents of all time now? There was a recent poll, and he always is number 6, number 7, around there, number 7. Why would that happen? And I think that one of the major reasons is a lot of the decisions he had to make were so complicated. He himself said that 50 years may go by before we know if these are good decisions or not, but I have to make them, and I'm going to make them. And, look, 50 years went by, and we realized that so many of the decisions he made, were really good ones. You think of the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. Obviously, the decision to drop the atomic bomb is the most controversial decision any president had ever made. And if, one thing I often hear is like anybody who said, many times I've heard people say, my son, my daughter, my grandpa, not my son, my father or my grandpa was scheduled to be among the, invading troops on the mainland of Japan. And let me tell you, it was not a bad idea that we dropped the bomb, because the casualties would have been so much worse. We would have lost hundreds of thousands of Americans. And so, but my point is, I think he was vulnerable because he had to make decisions that were just so complex that he knew that he couldn't be accurately judged upon them during his tenure.
That's such a great answer. Thank you, AJ. We have about 5 minutes left. If anybody has any comments at all, now would be the time to pop them in. I appreciate everybody who's been dropping in. I've seen the number go up and down, so I appreciate everybody who's watching now and who has been watching. Just to start to bring it full circle. So let's say somebody, we've talked about this book. We've talked about some of the interesting episodes from it. What do you hope people take away from reading Dewey Defeats Truman?
Well, two things. One is that I hope that people understand, one, what an important crossroads that year was in terms of the country turning into what it is now, in terms of the politics, the civil rights. There's so many things happening that we can feel like, there were, can you imagine, atomic tests going off in the Pacific? We didn't know at that time, whether there were, a number of people thought that there was going to be a world war happening at any moment, so just the sense of the fear, the anxiety, the excitement of the election, like what an important year it was, not just in terms of it's interesting, but in terms of the evolution of our country turning into what it is now. I think that's really important. The other thing is, Truman was a great man. And whether you agree with his politics or not, there's a reason why he's so well loved today, because he's a man that when you read the book, you feel yourself really, again, I'm saying this already, I think you're really pulling for him as a character. You want him to win. And there's a reason why he's beloved by the Republican Party today. Why, Donald Trump had to give a speech before the United Nations the first time the General Assembly. He quoted one president, Harry Truman. It wasn't Barack Obama. It was Harry Truman. I remember seeing Judge Roy Moore, very conservative politician, on the campaign trail, quotes Harry Truman. So you see that, like, he's beloved by the far right today, by the far left, by everybody in the middle. Why is that? And I think that's what I hope this book answers.
Fantastic answer. Well, thank you, AJ. It looks like we're good to go. If there are any last comments you want to say, I know you've got, the rumor has it, you have another book in the works. There's
a book that Harry will be a part of. It's coming out on February 1. It's a very, very controversial book, and I'm nervous about it because there's a lot in there that are gonna. I think there's a lot in this new book coming out where people are going to read it and say, "I can't believe this happened in the United States of America." So it's called White Lies, and the cover is up on Amazon now. You can see it. Even the cover, if you see the cover, you'll be like, "Wow, this is it's going to be an interesting time in February." Let me tell you that.
Well, we wish you luck, AJ, and thank you so much for being here again. I'm talking to AJ Baime, author of Dewey Defeats Truman, and you wrote The Accidental President. If you want to know more about the president who came from Missouri, the Show Me State, Harry S. Truman showed him, and AJ just did such a great job of depicting that story of how he did that, and it's a fantastic. Both books are fantastic. So, thank you, AJ. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it so much. I want to wish everybody well in Missouri. Thank you for having me. I'm so proud to get this play this tiny little role in your state. So I appreciate you having me. Thank you.